You don't really hate Gen Z. You're confused by them. They seem anxious, hyper-aware, distracted, and somehow deeply conscious at the same time. Too sensitive, too online, too much. But what if none of that is weakness? What if it's adaptation to a world that never slows down? To understand that, we have to look at the environment their minds were shaped in. What if their behavior isn't random or dramatic or exaggerated, but adaptive? The central idea is this: Gen Z's psychology is not a flaw in the system. It's a response to the system. They were born into permanent uncertainty. Unlike millennials who witnessed the rise of the internet, Gen Z never knew a world without it. Their brains developed alongside algorithms, and that matters more than we think. Research on neuroplasticity shows that the brain adapts to repeated stimuli, and when your daily environment includes endless scrolling, instant feedback, and constant comparison, your cognitive wiring subtly shifts. Attention becomes fragmented. Reward systems become hypersensitive. Dopamine loops, the same mechanisms studied in behavioral psychology and addiction research, get triggered dozens, sometimes hundreds, of times per day. It's not weakness, it's conditioning. And then there's social comparison theory, originally proposed by Leon Festinger. Humans naturally compare themselves to others to evaluate their worth. Now imagine doing that not with your classmates or co-workers, but with millions of curated lives online. Perfect bodies, perfect productivity routines, perfect relationships, all filtered, all optimized. Gen Z isn't more insecure because they're fragile, they're more exposed. But that's only one layer. Another psychological driver is what sociologists call precarity. Economic instability, climate anxiety, political polarization, these aren't background noise for Gen Z. They're the atmosphere. When uncertainty becomes chronic, the nervous system adapts. Studies on stress and cortisol regulation show that prolonged unpredictability increases baseline anxiety levels. So when Gen Z talks openly about mental health, therapy, burnout, it's not performative, it's linguistic evolution. They've developed a vocabulary for distress that previous generations often suppressed. And yes, sometimes that vocabulary gets overused, but overexpression is often the first step before regulation. There's also something else happening: identity formation. Classic developmental psychology, like Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, describes adolescence and young adulthood as a search for identity. Now amplify that process by social media, where identity is not only discovered but displayed. Profile pictures, bios, aesthetic choices, personal brands. For Gen Z, identity isn't just internal, it's performative, and that creates pressure. But it also creates experimentation. They can try on personalities, communities, beliefs faster than any generation before them. That's not superficial. It's accelerated identity exploration. And then we need to talk about emotional intelligence. Gen Z is often mocked for being too emotional. But emotional awareness is not emotional weakness. In fact, research on emotional intelligence, popularized by Daniel Goleman, shows that the ability to label and articulate emotions correlates with better interpersonal outcomes and long-term resilience. Gen Z grew up in conversations about boundaries, trauma, attachment styles. They use terms like gaslighting, narcissism, avoidant attachment, sometimes incorrectly, sure, but the psychological literacy is there. Compare that to generations where "I'm fine" was the universal coping strategy. So what looks like oversensitivity might actually be lower tolerance for dysfunction. And here's where it gets interesting. Every generation develops traits that solve the problems of their time. Baby boomers mastered stability. Gen X mastered independence. Millennials mastered adaptability. Gen Z, they might be mastering discernment. They question systems, work culture, gender norms, traditional success metrics. That questioning is often interpreted as laziness or entitlement. But psychologically, it resembles cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift perspectives and reject outdated schemas. Cognitive flexibility is strongly linked to creativity and problem-solving. In unstable environments, rigidity breaks. Flexibility survives. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Yes, rates of reported anxiety and depression are higher among Gen Z. Data from multiple mental health surveys confirms this trend. But increased reporting doesn't automatically mean increased pathology. Stigma has decreased, self-disclosure has increased, and access to diagnostic language has expanded. When you finally have words for your internal chaos, of course it feels louder. Silence can look stable, it isn't. And here comes the twist. What if Gen Z's so-called fragility is actually emotional transparency? What if their refusal to tolerate toxic workplaces leads to healthier organizational cultures in the future? What if their obsession with authenticity reshapes marketing, politics, even relationships? We often criticize the generation that mirrors our blind spots. Gen Z grew up watching adults burn out, divorce quietly, stay in jobs they hated for decades. They saw the cost of emotional suppression, so they're experimenting with something different. Boundaries, side hustles, digital communities instead of geographic ones. Is it messy? Absolutely. But evolution always is. Psychologically, Gen Z represents a nervous system trying to recalibrate in a hyper-connected world. They are not less resilient, they are resilient in a different direction. More sensitive to injustice, more reactive to hypocrisy, more vocal about inner struggles, and maybe, just maybe, that discomfort they create is necessary. Because every cultural shift begins with irritation. So, the next time you catch yourself judging Gen Z, pause. Ask yourself what environment shaped them. Ask yourself how your own psychology would look if you had grown up under constant digital observation. We don't choose the era that builds our nervous system. We only choose how consciously we respond to it. And maybe understanding the psychology of Gen Z isn't really about them. Maybe it's about understanding how all of us adapt to the worlds we inherit. If this perspective challenged you or made you reconsider something, subscribe for more deep dives into human behavior and the psychology shaping our everyday lives. And tell me in the comments, do you think Gen Z is fragile, or are they just early adapters of a new emotional era?